Hi there, and welcome to Talking True, where I speak to mystics, near-death experiences, healers, and people going through radical awakenings. And today on this episode, we have a really special guest. Her name is Robin Aisha Landsong, and she's a transformational speaker, a healer, an intuitive medical health expert, so she can connect in and tell you what's going on in your body. And she's an author as well, and she is a medicine singer. So I'm really thrilled to have you join us today, Robin. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So maybe it would be nice to tell the story of how you got started in doing this work.
So I've had multiple near-death experiences, which I like to call death and return experiences. And so those really broke me down and broke me open because, of course, they were in very difficult context. And I survived abduction and war and assault when I was a teenager. And so I think I was born with intuition. And so that actually helped me survive my experiences because I could read people quicker about how best to survive the situation. And one of the things I really love to get across is that when we have high intuition, when we're highly empathic or intuitive, that is so critical to do the work to resolve our trauma experience, so we don't go through life hyper-vigilantly reading everyone, but that we gain some freedom and spaciousness in our nervous system, so we have choice in how we're empathic and choice and freedom in how we use our intuition, because we might have used it in survival settings. And the more I've done my trauma resolution work, the more I get to choose and develop and broaden and deepen how I use my intuition to serve other people's healing, other people's growth, and really deepen into using compassion as my motivation to do readings with people rather than survival.
Yes. So you said you had two near-death experiences. Were they close together or were they far apart?
I had two when I was 8 years old. So I'm American, and I was abducted from the US in 1977, so post-Vietnam War. There's reason to believe, I don't have a way to entirely confirm, but there's reason to believe that the person abducted me had been through the Vietnam War, and he was going to be a mercenary in the Rhodesian War. So again, Rhodesian War is the 1977, 1978. That's the height of the war. So it's possible he was going to be a mercenary because the white government was recruiting, especially recruiting Vietnam vets.
Wow.
So in his distorted thinking, he was not a mentally well person. He took me with him and assaulted me, and then abandoned me in Rhodesia during the height of the war.
Wow. Wow, that's intense.
Mm-hmm.
And as an 8-year-old, you're 8, right? So what does an 8-year-old do when they're abandoned in a new country?
Adapt and survive minute by minute. And while it was terrifying to be alone, to be away from the abductor I was oddly enough no longer with the danger of him, but then I was in the danger of being a white child alone during this civil war. Yeah. And so I was actually picked up by soldiers who had an argument over me about whether to shoot me or whether to help me. And I couldn't understand their language, but I understood the argument. And so obviously the man who decided that I should be saved, he won the argument, and he took me and dropped me off with people who are in a rural village. So Zimbabweans, Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe, who was closer to the river that's the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And so I was taken in by those people, cared for them, and sung to. And so one of the women saw how traumatized I was, how closed off, how sheltered I was within myself. And she gave me mothering.
Mm.
And the family I came from was not nurturing, was not protective. So this was the first really being seen in my entire life. And my singing medicine is different than what she sang to me, but she opened in me what nurturing singing is. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to go ahead and sing the idea of what she sang to me.
That would be a gift. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So oh, oh, high. Yeah, 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 oh, hey, oh. So when she sang to me, she gave me hope that I can become alive. Like I felt life force in her. And I was so shut down from the trauma of being abducted and assaulted. And she filled me up with a spark again, that maybe I could become as open and free and full of this music that I could sense in her.
Mm.
And so the others cared for me. One of the men sang to me, the children sang to me, and it enlivened my ability to connect to others. And that's so much of what I like to teach and help others restore, because it is our ability to connect to ourselves, to our own body, our own breath, and connect to others that I believe is why we're here, that I believe is what makes life worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's absolutely beautiful. And so with this, with her singing to you, you eventually kind of came back into your power. It is what I'm hearing you saying, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it gave me hope, and I thought this was my new life. This is my new family. I honestly forgot that I was white because everybody I was looking at was that deep, dark skinned. And I was learning the songs. I was learning how to plant corn. And I didn't understand I was in the context of this dangerous civil war. And so one day I went to the river where the two women who were really mothering me, they had taken me to that river and covered my bruise in clay. Because when the abductor assaulted me, he broke my ribs and my whole back was just a bruise. So they had covered it in clay and they sang to me at this river.
Mm.
And they called me to sing with them. And when I could sing with them, they considered that I was going to be okay. And what they were doing with the clay was not only healing my bruise, but they were clearing the hatred on my body that came when the abductor assaulted me.
Mm.
And so one day I went back to that river. I was by myself, but to me, it was a safe place. And I was playing in the river and I looked up, and unbeknownst to me, a battle was starting in the field next to that river. And there was a soldier scouting that area. And when he saw me at very close range, he immediately pulled up his rifle. And I couldn't understand why I was being so loved by the people in this village and why this soldier had such hatred for me that he would pull up his gun to shoot me. And so before I could turn to run, he did shoot. He was so close I could see him pull the trigger. And when that bullet grazed the top of my head, it blew me off my feet. I was slammed down to the ground, and I was totally bewildered again why I was receiving so much love and why he had such hatred. And I began to rise up above my body. And I knew that if my life force didn't go back down into my body quickly, that was going to be the end of me.
Mm-hmm.
And while I wanted to live, because I was again connected to the people of this village, there was a part of me that was relieved to no longer have to fight so hard to survive, no longer have to defend myself and always be watching out for danger so much. So I rose up, I crossed over, my life force went through the back of my heart and out the back of my heart, and I traveled very quickly to this place of peace, this place of total serenity. And even as I speak that right now, I can feel that. Mm-hmm. Hopefully I'm sending that out to people who are watching and listening. And what was so unusual is that two women, younger versions of my two mamas, were there to greet me. And what I couldn't understand then is that 2 days later, the village was going to be attacked and they were going to cross over, but they were already there to greet me when I was shot. So it took me years to understand that they were still living, but they were the ones there to greet me, even though that they were still alive and wouldn't cross over until 2 days later. So they touched my face and helped me get oriented, and they showed me this golden sphere, kind of a little bit like here in my drawing that's behind me.
Wow.
And they showed me that I could go home to divine source, but I was conflicted about that because I didn't want to leave my newfound family, and they had named me Aisha. And so my conflict about, I could go home to the great source, to this brilliant light that would restore me, but wanting to stay with my family sent me backwards from that scene into a scene that was more like Ireland on a cold, wet day. And I was in this stone stairwell, and it was cold and dark and rainy. And I thought, I really had it better before. And so I ended up meeting another guide, and he took me through a dark cave, like kind of in this stone archway in again, what I perceive as kind of Ireland, which is my ancestry is mostly Irish. And so he really showed me that there was nothing wrong with me. He wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to improve me. And he was showing me that I was made by divine source, and that no matter what had happened to me in my lifetime of being abused, assaulted in my 8 years, that there was nothing wrong with me. I was still equal to all others in how I was created by divinity. And so that was just incredibly helpful to my understanding that I've always been okay, and that the abuse never diminished me.
Oh.
And
so you came back to your body. I'm get at a certain point.
Yes, I did. I'm going to. Yes, I came back to my body, and it was my mama found my body, and I was, of course, lifeless because my head had bled out. So the bullet didn't go in my head, it crossed the top of my head, and so I died of blood loss.
Wow.
And so she found my body, and she was stopping the blood flow. And at first she was wailing, because at this point I was above my body, looking down on the scene of her holding me and rocking me and wailing into the sky. And as I started to rise up, she changed her wailing to singing. And as I continued to cross through the veils closer to divine source that I call the Great Heart, and I was almost ready to reunite with the Great Heart, which I consider the source that sung me into being. And at the same time, she's here on this plane, and she had called on the ancestors to call me back. And so it was her singing and the ancestors singing. Wow. And it went through the veils, and it touched me where I was. And again, I'm going to give my best to give you a sense of what that singing was like. I am no way home. I'm a whole way high. I oh I oh. And they were reminding me that I hadn't done my purpose, which was to sing to people as they were singing to me, to remind all of us that we are worthy of compassion, worthy of divine love and human love. And so by them reminding me that I'm part of the choir of medicine singers, I made the choice to turn around and come back. And so I was traveling back in the tunnel that I had traveled in to come to Divine Source. And right before I was ready to come back to that final veil, I met a being who I perceived, her face was like a cougar. And she was reminding me, we have this entire cache of art images for you to draw to help other human beings remember their divine source, remember their goodness, remember their creativity. And when you are safe, because when you go back, you are not going to be safe. But when you are eventually safe, we're going to give you art image after art image to do these drawings to, again, help human beings remember their goodness. So then she moved me along, and I met the very final being before I was returned back to life. And I perceived her as the grandmother of all of us, the original mother. And her skin was black and her eyes were ever changing from blue to green to brown to black. And she sang to me, oh, ayo. And it was like I was a cathedral, and she was singing this sacred song inside my being. And she was saying to me, sing to them as I have sung to you, to help them remember. And then she returned me back to my body. And my mama Yetam was holding me and rocking me. And other people from the village showed up and carried me back to the village. And they put medicine on my head, and they sang to me to get the hatred from the bullet off my body so I wouldn't go through life confused by that hatred. And so they cared for me, and I was incredibly weak, but I was recovering some of my strength when about 2 days later, the soldiers came back and they attacked the village.
Mm.
And that has been one of my hardest things to heal. And as best as I know, it was a massacre. And one of the other mothers that had healed my bruise with the clay, she picked me up and she was running with me on her hip. And she was doing her best to get both of us away. And she was shot from behind. And so we both went down to the ground, and that started the bleeding on my head again. And I wanted to pull her with me, but I was 8, and she was yelling at me to keep going. And so I made the hardest decision of my life as I followed her instructions and I kept going. And I didn't make it too much farther myself. I was running down a hill that was sand, and I fell forward from, again, I was bleeding. And I had a second death experience. And this one was very different. and I met a being, and he was very powerful. And he showed me that creation, he showed me two planes of lands getting crushed together. And it was him who was doing it. He was so powerful. His skin was blue. He had a black bun on the top of his head. And he was showing me that he could crush two things together to make a mountain. And then he started showing me that the mountain comes down grain by grain in slides. And he said, shall we destroy the mountain so you can have the beach? And I said, I don't like the destruction part. Can I have the mountain and the beach? And he said, destruction makes available the ingredients for new creation. And it is hard for you to understand that destruction is part of the creation cycle. But I will hold the big picture for you. And so he gave me the understanding that even though everyone I love being massacred was the worst event of my entire life, that it would also break open some creation that I could not understand. And that for some reason, I was part of the cycle of reciprocity, the cycle of this new creation. So he returned me to life, returned me to the scene. And I was injured, I had fallen, I was incredibly weak. And he gave me the strength to crawl forward from that scene. And I had no will to live, but I was a drop in the ocean of him. And so he showed me where I was going to crawl forward and be found by a woman the next day. And so I did as he instructed. I pulled my body forward inch by inch. And in the morning, a woman that I now know, her name is Lucy, found me, washed the blood off my face, put me on her back like I was her own baby, and took me back to her homestead. When others saw she had a wounded white child, they said, don't bother with her, it's too dangerous. If you're caught by the white soldiers having a white child, you'll be accused of abducting her. If you're caught by the guerrilla soldiers having a white child, you'll be accused with siding with the enemy. And she said, I won't throw her away. She's a living being. And it is because of her courage to love bravely that I'm here to share the singing medicine, to share my story, to share compassion teachings, because she had the vision and the courage to save my life. She could have left me and I would have been dead in a few hours.
Mm-hmm.
But to feed me, care for me, wash the blood off me. And eventually she got me across the Limpopo River into South Africa. She gave me to the nearest white farming family because she assumed I was white Rhodesian. And they said, we'll find her family. They didn't know I was American. They ended up getting me to a hospital in South Africa. And from there, it was figured out that I was American. They kind of interrogated me to find out, who my family was. And I ended up being returned by an agent from South Africa to America, where my father picked me up, and I was returned back to my family, which was incredibly difficult and another layer of trauma for me. Mm-hmm. My family was very much about secrecy. They had no capacity to deal with what had happened to me. So when I tried to speak of it, my mother hit me and said, don't ever talk about this again. And so I did the incredibly energy consuming thing of repressing into my psyche, into my body, taking all those experiences and pushing them down, compressing them in my nervous system, which is an incredible capacity that all mammals have, but it comes at an incredibly high cost. Mm-hmm. So I was very numb. I was very shut down. I was very silent. I didn't really speak for the rest of that year. I would just be very limp, very unresponsive, and my capacity to connect to myself and connect to life was very limited because of all that suppression.
Wow, that's intense. So you, by then you were like 9 or 10. How old were you?
All of that happened in a summer. When I was first remembering it, it felt like 2 years. But when I really looked at my school records, I was abducted at the end of second grade. And then I was back at third grade and in a different school.
Wow.
And I look at the pictures of myself, and like I said, I hardly spoke. I didn't make eye contact.
Mm.
And so it's very important to notice those kids that are so suppressed and to have that spacious compassion that they may not be able to speak of it, what has been happening for them, but if we can at least give them spacious, heart-centered presence and our attention, then they may not be able to heal from their trauma for years. But I remember that people who were kind to me and just stayed still with me, that was very helpful in restoring my faith that there were some decent people.
Gosh, what a story. That's incredible. So how did you manage to heal and come out of all of that? Because that I mean, that is so much to deal with.
Mm-hmm. And again, I kept it repressed for as long as I could. When I was a teenager, I had another assault that started sending me into the nervous system has an ability to go into complete shutdown. It's a very extreme state of parasympathetic. And so all mammals can go into such a freeze state that their heart rate and their breathing is not detectable. And it's a way, if we are going to be killed, it's a way to not feel being killed. So if the gazelle is almost caught by the tiger, but they manage to escape, or the tiger gets distracted and goes away, the gazelle will go into such a state of dormancy, they will look and appear entirely dead, because a predator will be less interested in a dead creature. And then if we get to safety, we come back out of that frozen state. And our heart rate will come back, our breath rate will come back, our awareness will come back. So as a teenager, because of the second assault, I started going into that dormancy state, that pre-death state, anytime my heart rate got up. So I was in swim practice, and I would go into this kind of unconscious paralysis. And the medical system at that time, that was about 1980, 88 or so, when I was in high school. And they didn't have post-traumatic stress training. They didn't have parasympathetic shock on their radar. So while they did tons of tests on me and they assessed that I had extreme stress, they never asked me if I was being abused or if I'd been assaulted or if I had any trauma history. And so I'm really appreciative of all the people who are doing trauma training so that abuse survivors like myself can start to get recognized and get appropriate compassion and help, instead of being shamed for, like, what happened is I ended up getting shamed on top of all my other trauma of like, oh, you're just making this up for attention. And the truth is, people cannot go into parasympathetic shock by choice. That is a biological, innate autonomic nervous system state. And so we can't think our way into that. So it has to be in response, cause and effect. So I at that point, it was just kind of evident that like something's really distressed in my nervous system. My heart was really showing the impact of the cortisol. And so I really started into the trauma because I couldn't keep functioning. I was, going into this paralysis, unconscious state. When I went to college, it happened again, and I got resuscitated by the ambulance. So that's my 5th death experience. And I just want to let people know that to get resuscitated by the AED, when you're actually in the tunnel, it doesn't feel bad at all. It looks terrible to be vaulted, but it actually feels great when you're dead. But I was in the tunnel, and it was the AED machine would like, boom, pull me closer back to life. And then the very final one, so they did it 3 times, which means I was, my heart rate was stopped. The very third time, it didn't feel so great, and it pulled me back into my body, and I wasn't fully conscious yet, and so I was speaking the trauma, and people were quite stunned at what I spoke. And so that kind of also sent me into another place of people saying, what happened to you? Like the things that you spoke of were horrendous. And so I really couldn't function after that. I was a college student. I was trying to hold it together. But I ended up going to inpatient trauma treatment unit that did recognize post-traumatic stress, did recognize trauma response. And that really began my journey. I can't say those were positive experiences, but it did start me in my healing process. When I got out of 2 months of inpatient post-traumatic stress treatment, I found a really incredible therapist, and that she was incredibly helpful to me. I went 3 times a week. That's kind of all I did. Was I worked just as much as I could, and I just went to therapy all the time. And what I really love to get across to people is that there's so many approaches and methods to heal post-traumatic stress and trauma response. And so really addressing the nervous system, the body. And so talk therapy is great. There's also EMDR therapy. There's all kinds of body modalities. So if talk therapy is not your thing, then don't let that be a reason to not do your healing. So there's craniosacral, massage with, and the key is finding the right practitioner who's trauma informed, who you feel safe with. So there's, Feldenkrais, there's Qigong, there's yoga, there's meditation techniques. And meditation might be something that's later stage for trauma survivors, because just sitting still with trauma response in our body might be too much at the early stages. David Trevelyan has written a great book about why you might want to wait for a while and do very supported techniques first. I'm a huge fan of EMDR therapy, which is the rapid eye movements. And then the other place I really love to emphasize is eating well. You really can't do the depth of healing your nervous system, healing your brain, if you're eating a ton of sugar, if you're eating a ton of fast food, if you're eating a ton of processed food. So I consider feeding yourself whole foods, staying home and cooking. And it doesn't matter to me too much what approach you take, as long as it's whole food, less sugar, less carbohydrate, less wheat, less artificial ingredients, then you're going to be serving your body and caring for yourself in a way that maybe you didn't get cared for as a child. And the other important place that's the foundation of nervous system healing is nourishing your adrenals. So the adrenals are the little glands on top of your kidneys, and they get exhausted when we go into startle response. They get exhausted when we go into flight or fright. So nourishing, researching that, some ideas of where you can start your research are cordyceps, rhodiola, licorice, and again, a non-caffeine or very low caffeine diet, low to no sugar. I've been not eating sugar in a decade, and I just don't plan on eating sugar for the rest of my life, because our bodies don't really need processed sugar. So I eat stevia, dates, honey, and again, loving ourselves, loving our body is the antidote to not being cared for as a child. So the more you weren't cared for as a child, the more triple you need to care for your body and your being as an adult.
Yes. Wow. So you work with, you have clients one-on-one, or you teach courses? How can people find you if they feel like they want to work with you?
Yeah, so I do 5-person groups. I can't keep up with individual sessions anymore in terms of the demand. I also teach classes. And so I teach things like generational healing and addressing those ancestral pieces. and healing ourselves in developmental stages. So I sing to people at their embryonic self, at their infant self. And I also love teaching self-criticism to self-compassion. And so self-criticism keeps post-traumatic stress going, whereas self-compassion can really calm the nervous system and help restore our self-esteem. And I love to teach people embodiment. Again, I'm not so much about ascension or spiritual practices that make us kind of go up and out, because if people haven't addressed their trauma, that can become just another form of dissociation.
Yes.
That could be a later stage after you've done your trauma work. And so in my 5-person groups, I sing to, it's 5 people from around the world sign up, and they're so delightful because people bring their vulnerability, their strengths. I sing to each person their own medicine song, and it's through Zoom, so it's recorded. And I do a drawing, an intuitive drawing for each person to help them get a sense of their strengths, their vulnerabilities, their gifts. Because the way I use my intuition is to say, I see you, you're real, you matter. And that the singing is that ultimate kind of primal, beyond the mind place to receive that mama nurturing that I was given. And so it's my honor to take what my African mamas gave me and sing that to people, because kind of who doesn't need more nurturing in the world? Who doesn't need more acceptance and sense of belonging? Because when we are traumatized, it really impacts our sense of being real, of belonging to ourselves, belonging in community, and belonging to the human race, and belonging on the planet.
Yes. You know, the thing is, what I've found with working with the people that I work with is that trauma is fairly common. I mean, not everybody's been through the trauma that you've been through, because that was really intense, but there are subtle forms of it as well, right? You know, and it still has a big impact. It has a big impact on how you present. It has a big impact on how you connect into your innate gifts, skills, and talents, and then finding the courage and the confidence to express those. There's often a tendency to withhold that out of fear, because it's always about trying to keep yourself safe. And you know,
interesting. Kristen Neff, one of my teachers on self-compassion, she talks about our nervous system is more wired for safety than for happiness.
Yes.
And then what's so subjective about that is how we perceive what is safety, which can be shut down, which can be not taking the risk to reach out and connect to others, which can be numbing ourselves, which is the opposite of happiness. So when I was reading that in her teachings, it really made sense to me about why people do addiction that they know is harming them. Because again, we're more wired for the perception of safety. But numbness actually is unsafe, because we can't advocate for ourselves. We can't listen to our body and sense our yes and our no. And we're more susceptible to going to outside authority for our yes or our no, for our answers of how do I live my life. So that's why I love the embodiment piece, the healing the nervous system, because then people get their agency, their voice, and like you were saying, your gifts and your strengths. Because the very best way to increase our sense of belonging is to give to others, to increase their sense of safety, to increase their sense of belonging. Because then we feel, oh my gosh, I served someone else. I helped someone else. And one of my favorite spiritual practices is Tonglen practice, the Buddhist meditation that Pema Chodron teaches. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yes, I am. I am.
And that breathing in our difficulty or distress and exhaling the remedy or the antidote to ourselves or to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, say we have a cold and we're sick and we're in bed, and it's disappointing to have to cancel all our plans. It's disappointing to feel so terrible in bed. And so last time I was sick, I was breathing in my frustration about being sick and exhaling, feeling good in your body to everyone in my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And breathing in my disappointment that my immune system, didn't catch this pathogen, and exhaling to everyone in my town that they could restore their faith in their body and their relationship with their body. And within about 5 cycles of that, I'm not feeling sorry for myself about being sick.
Mm-hmm.
And energetically, we get bigger instead of being collapsed. And ironically, I end up feeling more enlivened in myself when I'm sending out good wishes, goodwill, the antidote to suffering to other beings.
Yes. And then it's not just about you and your kind of personal struggles. It's a gift that you're sending out to your local community or to the world at large as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And everything you've been saying about trauma, what occurred to me and has come, through many times is that, even though someone may not have had too many traumatic experiences as a child, as an adult, there can be trauma in the workplace when you're not being seen or heard or valued, or you're closed down, or you're not allowed to kind of speak up for yourself. And again, I think that's really common. That happens a lot, especially in bigger organizations, where people feel that they're bringing a lot of value to the organization, and they're just not being recognized for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that can be kind of traumatic for people in terms of then standing in their power and being able to express for themselves.
Yeah. And speaking of the way you said that too reminded me, I hadn't answered one of your previous questions. The way to find me is my name, is my website, robinlandsong.com. So landsong.com. And so you bring up a really important point about cherishing one another. And that if people haven't had something blatant like being assaulted or having a direct violence in their home, they may have had attachment trauma, which is having somebody, ideally, we have somebody who can notice us as a child and say, I see you have a look on your face. And I'm wondering if you're sad, what's going on? And that's called mirroring. Daniel Siegel is one of my teachers, and he has amazing books. Daniel Siegel, he's written so many books about healthy parenting and what happens if we don't get enough of that mirroring, that accurate reflection from another human being. Can be your aunt, can be your neighbor. It doesn't have to be your parents.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody to say, I see you, which is what I got when I was with the women and some of the men in Zimbabwe. And so that taught me how to connect. So even though my biological family wasn't the safe people I was to connect with, they taught me what love is to receive and love is to give. And so when you're speaking of that in the workplace, so many, say if 90% of people in that workplace have unresolved attachment trauma,
Mm-hmm.
they're all recycling that and bouncing off like avoidance or overreactivity or anxiety with each other, rather than just being able to say, I see your strengths, I see your non-strengths. So let's give you the right job so you can do your strengths and
Mm-hmm.
have authentic motivation to come to work.
Yes.
And one of my colleagues was talking about there was somebody who wasn't performing very well at work. They showed up late. They, kind of had an attitude that was bringing everybody else down. And somebody had the wisdom to go to them and say, what do you like to do? What do you feel is your strength? And the person actually said problem solving with people. And what they were doing was writing policy. So they said, I really like helping people in crisis on the phone and talking them through it. So they shifted them over to when people had a crisis, and needed a problem solved. And then they shifted everything instead of writing policy, which they hated, they
Mm-hmm.
love showing up to work. And how many people like helping people in crisis on the phone?
Yeah, I
People.
know. It's just like, no, thanks.
Yeah, and they started dressing better. They showed up to work on time because they were being properly utilized in what divine source had given them as their strengths. And they no longer had to write policy. And they ended up being like one of like kind of the star people on the team, and other people enjoyed working with them. So when we value each other,
Mm-hmm.
when we say, oh my goodness, your ability to be in empathy with me is incredible, or
Mm-hmm.
your ability to problem solve, or whatever people's strengths are. And again, that embodiment piece lets us speak up and say, this isn't the right job for me. I hate coming to work.
Yes.
Can I feel into my body sensation? What lights me up? So for me, deeply seeing people lights me up. Being able to utilize my intuition, my empathic ability to sense others lights me up. I can do it all day long. It doesn't tire me out. And then, of course,
Mm-hmm.
my art and singing to people and watching what is needed to help people's transformation. Where are people stuck? Like
Mm-hmm.
being this kind of detective, this intuitive detective. Where in their body is their generational trauma? Where are they berating themselves and need to shift over to compassion? Like, I love using my intuition for that. And
Mm-hmm.
then naming it for people in a loving, kind way, filled with compassionate language, and watching their face light up and say, oh, I didn't realize that was my problem.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I've gotten tons of training in anatomy, biology. My formal training is as a craniosacral therapist, which again is working with the nervous system. And then I've spent 22 years adding to my training to really understand what is it that makes people thrive, and what is it that compresses people into a state of not being able to speak up for themselves, advocate for themselves, know their gifts. To be able to help people come back into their creativity is to help more people show up in their beauty. And like sometimes I was just talking with a friend yesterday, and I was saying, it moves me every time just that I got to go through all these hard experiences, and it opened me up to be able to do the singing medicine, to have this art pour through me, to be able to have this level of intuition so I can serve people and see people. And sometimes I can't believe how lucky I am. And, if you ask me when I was 20, I was still in the gritty years of trauma healing, and I didn't feel lucky at all. But now in my 50s, I feel lucky that I got broken down, broken open, so I can help other people on their journey and just get to see what people are truly made of is goodness.
Yes. 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 That's absolutely beautiful. Really. What a gift. What a gift for you, and what a gift for people that find you and work with you. So, Robin, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours, but it might be good to end this episode here.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to invite you back. But before we go, can you just remind people where they can find you again? Where do they find you?
So my website is my name, robinlandsong.com. And I just want to tell you some things I have that are about to release. I'm about to release a 7-song album. We studio recorded the Singing Medicine. After that, I'll release my Singing Medicine library. So it'll be dozens and dozens of my Singing Medicine songs. And then after that, I will release my audiobook, Loving Bravely. That's my whole story of surviving the Rhodesian War and my return trip 40 years later and reuniting with some of the people who saved my life. So wow. I have tons of projects coming. Eventually, I'll have an art deck of my art with affirming things. And so it's just my mission to keep creating. And and just helping other people remember their brilliance also.
Well, wonderful, Robin. Thank you so much. This has been a really powerful episode, and I'm extremely grateful that you were able to join me today, because I'm sure viewers will get a lot out of what you've shared. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for the work that you do in the world.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I'm absolutely loving this channel, and and just being able to share in this way, it's really and I think it's needed at this time in the world with what's happening. So thanks again. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate your work. Thank you.
And in Venda, in the language in the area I was from, thank you is rolevua.
Oh, lovely. Rolevua. That's so beautiful. It sounds so poetic. It's just lovely. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate it. As always, if you enjoyed the content of this episode, then please share with friends and family. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. That would be really great. As always, continue shining bright. Be well, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.